Okay, what I'm going to do this morning is discuss a couple of topics related to the theoretical and empirical basis for rehabilitation with offenders. Let's see if this works. Yeah. So I just want to start by saying a couple of things. First of all, when I've cited other people's work, you can see that on the slides. I've got a few graphs I'm going to show you which are taken from a piece of work we're doing in the National Offender Management Service. And I really wanted to acknowledge the team of people that I work with, because none of this would happen without them. Rosie Travers and Howard Phillips here somewhere, and he's going to be speaking tomorrow morning, and he'll go into a bit more detail about some of this if you're interested. And Daniel Hudson and Jill Attrell. I think some of you will probably know Jill Attrell, who is the boss of our part of the National Offender Management Service. So I thought I would start with telling you what the key points are going to be, and that means you can listen to this slide and then get on your Blackberries or start tweeting and or have a little nap if you did the fun run. It's so bright up here you could all be asleep and I wouldn't know, so feel free to take the time if you want to. So I'm going to do three things in this presentation. First of all, I'm going to talk about three of the most, perhaps the three best known rehabilitation models for working with offenders: the risk needs responsivity model, the good lives model, and the resettlement or re-entry model. And so I'll have a quick look at those three models and how compatible or complementary they are, what their evidence base is like. Secondly, I'm going to move into talking about the segmentation project, which is a project we've been working on in the National Offender Management Service, where we're trying to look at distinct risks and needs in different subgroups or segments of offenders. And then thirdly, I want to talk a bit about how we could improve our knowledge about rehabilitation, and how, just as Kareem was saying, how research and policy and practice could perhaps be brought together a bit more, because in the role that I'm in now, I spend a lot of time trying to talk to policymakers and practitioners about what the research says, and talk to researchers about what questions policymakers and practitioners have. And I feel like I'm often sort of scurrying backwards and forwards between different groups of people. So I wanted to talk a bit about that. Because I work for the government, whenever we give a presentation, we have to get our slides cleared by various people so that we don't embarrass the government. So when I sent these slides off, I got them back with a note saying, some interesting changes of direction in this talk, which I hope will make it interesting. Also, one of the people who looked at them put some notes on the slides, and I'm pretty sure I've taken them all off. I did look quite carefully, but if you see a strange little red box that says something like, I like this graph, it wasn't me, it was just something that I missed and forgot to remove. Okay, so let's look first at the three major rehabilitation models. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with these models, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing them, but I'll give you a quick overview of the features of each model, and then maybe look at some examples of how well they work and where they don't work for us. So let's start with the risk needs responsivity model. This is probably the best known model in offender rehabilitation. And these are the key things that we've learned, or the key messages of this model for those of us who work with offenders. First of all, there's a clear message about risk and need, that rehabilitation should be proportionate to the risk posed by an individual offender, and that rehabilitation efforts should address only criminogenic needs, so that is the needs that are related to or associated with reoffending. In terms of responsivity, which is about what offenders will respond to, what kind of approaches they respond to, what we've learned from the RNR research is that interventions are best if they follow the cognitive behavioural model, and if they mainly focus on teaching skills. We've also learned about the need for interventions to be delivered by trained and skilled staff, and for treatment integrity to be a key focus for the work. So just to focus a little bit more on criminogenic needs and what they are, Andrews and Bonter, who I guess are the main developers of the RNR model, have set out what they call, there's eight major criminogenic needs. I can't remember what they call, we always call them the Great Eight, but I'm pretty sure that's not their term for them. The Great Eight criminogenic needs, and then the Big Four, which are the kind of the biggest four of the eight. And three of those four I'm going to talk about particularly. One is antisocial attitudes, another is thinking deficit, which is best understood as impulsivity and low self-control. and also antisocial personality. The other one was antisocial history, criminal history, the big four. I guess another thing that the RNR model has brought to our field is a real emphasis on robust quantitative research, and that's mainly focused on psychological interventions designed to address those three things in particular: attitudes, personality, and thinking deficits. So that's an excerpt from one of the Andrews and Bonter papers, which just lists their grade 8. I don't know how well you can see it anyways. In our work in NOMS, this is our commissioning intention. I'm just going to take a pause here. This is not really advertising for my organisation because, like all big organisations, it's got strengths and weaknesses. But one of the things I'm very proud of is working for an organisation that has said emphatically we are interested in evidence-based practice, and that we want to have a team of people who will keep us focused on the evidence base and to whom we can go to ask about what the research tells us. And so last year, the NOMS have published this document called our Commissioning Intentions document, which sets out what we want from prisons and probation services in terms of services for offenders. And one of the nice things about this document, which is worth having a look at, is that it has a chapter on evidence and evidence-based commissioning. And in that chapter, we set out our version of the Great 8. Actually, there's 9 of them, so we had to call them something else, the Fine 9. We separated out, in Andrews and Bonter's work, they combined drug and alcohol misuse into one factor, but we separated them out because some of our work, so Philip Howard's work in particular, has shown us that alcohol and drug misuse have different relationships with different types of criminality. So that alcohol, there's no surprise obviously, I don't know that you know this, alcohol misuse is most associated with violence, drug misuse is most associated with acquisitive offending. So we wanted to treat them separately for the purposes of our commissioning. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but you can just see that what we've done in this table is list that we call them reoffending factors, the main criminogenic needs. We've given some behavioural examples of indicators for when those needs are present. The middle column, we've called it desired intermediate outcomes, also kind of known as the desistance column, the column that talks about what we would like people to be achieving in order to support desistance. And then the last 2 columns set out our review of the evidence in terms of what we consider to be an evidence-based approach, or an approach that's supported by enough evidence to feel confident in it. And if there isn't any evidence, as there isn't for quite a lot, you can see here we've got second one down, social network also engaged in crimes, antisocial associates. When we reviewed the evidence, there is very little evidence available about what effectively helps people change their social networks. We found very little research that met kind of our typical standards of research quality. So in that case, we have to use the final column, which talks about promising approaches, approaches where there is some evidence to point in a particular direction, but not enough evidence yet to draw a more confident conclusion. So in that case, in case of antisocial associates, there's no conclusively evidence-based approach, but we can look at mentoring and circles of support and accountability as 2 examples of approaches where the evidence looks promising. So just to give you an example of this, this table looks simple, but of course it wasn't. A lot of reviewing of evidence went into creating it, and there's still people arguing about whether or not we got it right. There goes the final part of the table looking at leisure and homelessness. Okay. So I just wanted to consider the evidence base for the RNR model. This is the model that has the strongest evidence base by far for effectively working with offenders. James Maguire has helpfully just published a chapter summarising the evidence, and in that he tells us that the count of meta-analyses about what works with offenders has now reached 100, which is a really significant achievement for our field. And when you look at the findings across those meta-analyses, in this chapter here he's got a nice table of all 100 of them, which goes on for quite a long time, as you can imagine, takes up most of his chapter. What you can see is that consistently the findings of the meta-analyses about what works to reduce reoffending support the RNR principles, that interventions adhering to those principles are consistently more effective than other types of interventions. The other thing we know, though, is that intervention effectiveness is greatest in the medium range of risk. So that offenders who are low likelihood of reoffending tend not to respond to, well, I say respond to intervention, perhaps that's not the right word, but tend not to show reduced reconviction rates after interventions. And in some cases, studies are telling us that intervening with low-risk offenders can make them worse. And at the highest range of risk, highest risk levels as well, it looks like most psychological interventions are not effective. So just show you an example from one of our prison service programs. So if you follow the RNR model, what we would predict is that a well-designed cognitive skills program, that is a program that addresses impulsivity and low self-control, one of the big four. If the program is well designed, if it's delivered with integrity, and if it's the right level of dose for the risk of our participants, a program like that should reduce reconviction rates. And here you can see in this paper which we published last year, using a slightly unusual methodology, but with a very large sample size, we had 17,000 offenders who had been through the Enhanced Thinking Skills Intervention, which is a fairly simple cognitive skills program, delivered quite widely across our prisons and probation services. So 17,000 people who'd done the ECS program, and they were released between January 2000 and December 2005. And we compared those to a cohort of prisoners released in the same time period, and we had 19,700 odd in the cohort. And the cohort of people who had not done ETS. And what you see here is a really nice example of what RNR looks like in practice. So you can see that along the bottom I've got risk, so this is using OGRS, a very good predictor. So the OGRS score tells us the predicted rate, the likelihood of reoffending, going from 0% or less than 10% on the left-hand side to up to 99% on the right-hand side. So you can, so we split the sample into these risk deciles, and you can see that for every risk decile, the group of prisoners who've done ETS had a lower reconviction rate than the prisoners who hadn't done ETS. So these are not matched samples, I should say, but what we tried to do to make up for that was to compare them by risk level. Just the other couple of things that are interesting about this, in each decile, I should say that the differences here are significant for every decile except the final one, so except for the 80 to 99, which is a good example of the risk needs responsivity principle, showing that at the very high level of risk, this intervention wasn't effective, but it was effective at lower levels of risk. The other thing that's interesting about these figures is that in every decile, the reoffending rate for the prisoners who'd done ETS was what you would expect for the decile below, if you like. So effectively, they looked like they were a risk category, one risk category below what they really were, whereas the untreated cohort of prisoners, their reoffending rates were always where you would expect them to be in terms of the predictor. So that's just a nice, clear example of what an RNR intervention looks like in practice in terms of its outcomes. But let's have a look at some of the limitations, because there's also a number of limitations in the RNR model. These are either things that are things that people complain about, or things that have yet to be established, or genuine limitations. So one is that some people feel, with reason, that the RNR model overemphasises the individual propensity to crime. And within that, it's over-focused on antisocial attitudes and impulsivity, poor self-control. So most RNR interventions evaluated under the RNR model focus quite narrowly on one or two risk factors. And those risk factors very much have the assumption that these are the key drivers of crime. And in fact, the RNR model with its big four says exactly that the key drivers of crime are antisocial attitudes and impulsivity, poor self-control. Another criticism of the model is that when people create and run RNR interventions, that they tend to say, or talk about, pretty much like I've done here, programs changing people, programs reducing reoffending, and that is contradictory to what happens if you talk to offenders themselves about their journey to desistance. So in the desistance literature, when the desistance approach, as I'm sure you know, asks people to describe and tries to understand the process of change. People never say in those research studies, it was a program that changed me. They talk about, particularly about their social support and social networks and people believing in them and giving hope. Some of those things can happen through programs, but offenders themselves rarely attribute change to a program. And one of the other problems with the RNR model is that although it has some clear principles about risk and need and dose and sequencing, there isn't any detailed guidance on those things. So in fact, if you look through Andrews and Bonter's incredible book, you can't find a definition anywhere of what's meant by high risk, or how the different risk groups separate, or in fact, what dose any particular risk group needs. So although the principle is higher risk needs greater dose, we can't narrow that down to literally a number of hours. And in a job like mine, that's the kind of question that I get asked. How long does an intervention have to be to make a difference? And it's not good enough for me to say, well, longer if he's high risk, because that's not considered to be a detailed enough answer. People want to know, should it be 20 hours or 40 hours or 100 hours or 300 hours? And at the moment, the RNR literature doesn't give us that level of guidance. Another problem with it, it's maybe not fair to say this is the problem with the model, but is that people don't really like it. So when I show, let me just go back to this graph. If I show a graph like this to a group of prison governors, which I did the other day, they all look at it and nod, and then they say, how can that be? How can that program really make that difference? Because it's just, 10 people sitting in a room for a few weeks. How can that program make so much difference? There's something intuitive about the RNR model that doesn't feel right to people. And so what happens is that it becomes associated in people's minds with rigid program delivery because of the focus on treatment integrity, on a lack of individualisation, which is the most common complaint, that RNR programs are one size fits all, that they don't individualise for different types of people. And because of the important emphasis on treatment integrity, RNR programs are often also associated with high cost. I'm not sure that's fair, but that's what people believe, that these programs cost more because you have to monitor their integrity. Whereas if you do something where you don't have to monitor integrity, it's cheaper, even though it might not be effective. So there's something about the RNR model that is not intuitively appealing to people outside of the scientific community. And here's another limitation. Despite like these 100 narrative or statistical reviews, and we still don't know very much about subgroups of offenders. There are some groups of offenders, sexual offenders in particular, and violent offenders and domestic violence offenders, where there is an enormous amount of research on that particular offence type, and I'm guessing that lots of people in this room do a lot of that research. When you look at other groups of offenders, maybe younger offenders, women in particular, non-sexual, non-violent offenders, the research base is much less compelling. I'm going to come back and give you some more examples of this in a little while, but I'm going to move on now to talk about the Good Lives model. This is a more recent rehabilitation theory. It's a strengths-based rehabilitation theory, and that's its key characteristic. And the Good Lives model directs us to help offenders find the resources needed to live a good life. And the assumption is that a good life is incompatible with offending. So and also something that we all desire. So if we can enable offenders to find their way to a good life, their offending will probably disappear because the satisfaction and rewards of leading a good life are all that somebody needs. And I'm sure you're aware that there's been considerable debate about the Good Lives model versus the RNR model, and how they fit together and which one's better and which one should come first. And in particular, I think the authors or the originators of both models will claim that their model somehow subsumes the other one. And I think personally that debate is all a bit distracting. Most practitioners that I speak to don't have any trouble unifying the two models. And it's a kind of academic debate that almost goes on over their heads in the way that a thundercloud can pass by, and if you don't look up, you don't see it. I could spend the whole presentation talking about those differences, but I deliberately decided not to do that because I'm not sure how helpful it is to to go into those issues in detail. What we can say is that one of the claims that the Good Lives model makes is that compared to the RNR model, it's more engaging and motivating. So the RNR model is seen as a model that addresses deficits. One of the metaphors uses that of a pin cushion, where if you have imagine a cushion full of pins and each pin represents a risk factor, then the RNR model kind of plucks them out and throws them away, leaving presumably a cushion full of holes. Whereas the Good Lives model is interested in kind of building, one of those metaphors that's going to go wrong now, building up the cushion and making it, you know, more satisfyingly plump, or whatever you like in a cushion. Anyway, it's definitely seen as an approach that the people involved, the offenders themselves, will find more engaging and motivating, because it meets our human needs to develop and self-actualise. So in this model, criminogenic needs are not seen as the causes of reoffending so much as obstacles that prevent the achievement of a good life. Okay, so looking at the evidence base, again we've had a recent helpful summary by Gwenda Willis and Tony Ward in the same book as the Maguire chapter, looking at the Good Lives model and does it work. And I think it's pretty fair to say that at the moment the evidence base is really very limited. In the chapter they argue that because the Good Lives model and the RNR model actually have similar goals, or they phrase them differently, you could say that the RNR evidence also supports the Good Lives model, but personally I think that's a bit of a stretch of an argument. If you look at research, that is, if you look for research that particularly focuses on the Good Lives model, there is some early research that supports some elements of the model, and some very preliminary research into what they call Good Lives model consistent interventions. But we have yet to be anywhere near a place where we can have one meta-analysis, let alone 100. So this is a very early, very, very early stage of research. And I think if we were going to criticise the Good Lives model, we would probably say that it's been seized upon with great enthusiasm, and perhaps that enthusiasm has got in the way of people looking at the model in a more scientific and evaluative way. So at the moment we have no robust studies of the impact of a model, of a programme or intervention designed specifically to use the Good Lives model as its theoretical guide and as effect of such a programme on reconviction. So here's the limitations. The lack of evidence base is its big limitation. There's also some of the very early preliminary research does suggest that even though participants in a Good Lives approach prefer the approach and they do find it more engaging and motivating, they also can come out of a Good Lives programme with less certainty about their risk factors. Now you may or may not see that as a good thing, but it's definitely a difference between the Good Lives model and the RNR model. That Good Lives participants, or the Good Lives programme seems to, because of its focus on strengths, can sometimes lose its focus on what are the crucial issues to address. There's also quite a lot of variation in practitioner interpretation. And so lots of people have, well, some people have seized upon this model, like I said, with great enthusiasm, and interpreted it for their own programme. In some cases they've taken a typical RNR or relapse prevention programme and added a Good Lives module at the end, which I think the Good Lives originators of the model would say is not a Good Lives approach. You don't just add it on the end, it should permeate throughout an intervention. Other people have gone for a much more full-on Good Lives approach. So there's a lot of variation in how the model is interpreted, and perhaps that happens because we don't yet have an evidence base. The third, I want to look at what we call the resettlement. In the UK we call it the resettlement model, but I think in North America it's perhaps more commonly known as the re-entry model. And this approach to rehabilitating offenders focuses on some of the other factors in the list, the Grade 8 or the Fine 9. And in particular, when you look at descriptions of re-entry programmes, they focus on helping offenders secure more permanent or stable accommodation, helping them secure employment, and addressing alcohol and drugs problems. So this kind of approach is definitely multimodal. It tackles a number of important criminogenic targets at the same time, and it's a very practical, solving problems in offenders' lives approach. Okay. Look at the evidence base for this kind of approach to helping offenders desist from offending. Well, there's definitely strong evidence that the target issues for a resettlement or a re-entry programme are associated with crime. So there's strong evidence for the predictive validity of unemployment and lack of accommodation and alcohol problems and drug problems as factors that predict reconviction. Unfortunately, there's a lack of, with the exception of drug dependency, which has got a very good evidence base for what works and a number of different treatments that work. The evidence about what works to address these issues is really thin. So last year, as part of our work, my team commissioned a series of rapid evidence assessments on each of the fine 9. So we asked, for example, for an evidence review on housing. What works to help offenders who are homeless secure permanent and stable housing? What works to help offenders secure employment that is meaningful and long-lasting? And what we found is that although there's lots of evidence that these things are problems, that there's lots of programs to address them, there's been very little clear evaluation of what works. So in terms of helping offenders secure housing that becomes a permanent and stable solution, there is really very little research indeed that tells us how you do that. Another problem is that you often get, when mentoring is a good example of a type of intervention that perhaps is focused on these sorts of targets. And another problem that you get, which is often a little bit underreported or not very clearly reported, is very high dropout rates, which is usually explained away as poor motivation. So our employment intervention didn't work because he dropped out because he wasn't motivated. And we all know about poor motivation, but to explain away the effectiveness of intervention because of poor motivation just isn't very helpful. What we need is interventions that engage people and overcome the problem of poor motivation, not interventions that only work if you've got someone who's motivated. Other than the lack of evidence base, the other limitation to the resettlement model is the fact that it's very focused on practical assistance with social dynamic risk factors, but misses that focus on the more internal psychological risk factors, the attitudes and thinking deficits. And here's a really nice example. If you've not come across this paper, I really recommend you read it because I think it's a very interesting research study in lots of ways. This study, it's an American study, and the authors set out to look at the differences between offenders released from prison on parole in terms of the people who succeeded, made it to the end of their parole period without reoffending, and those who failed, who committed a further crime whilst on parole. And what the authors expected to find was that employment and housing would differentiate the two groups, that the parole successes would have found a job and got somewhere to live, and the parole failures would have struggled with those things. In fact, what they found was that jobs and accommodation didn't differentiate the two groups. Both the successes and the failures had achieved employment and housing in equal proportions. And so at this point, rather than giving up, this is what I like about this study, they kind of shifted direction and started to look at, well, in that case, what were the differences? And they used a variety of qualitative methods to complement their quantitative study. And what they learned from that is that both the successes and the failures said it was easy to find a house and a job if you were prepared to do any job. And that was the key difference. They all agreed on that. The difference was whether or not they were prepared to do any job. So you can see here a list instead of the things that differentiated the successes from the failures. And one of them was the attitude towards employment. So the parole successes, who interestingly also had a bit more of a family man identity, said that they were prepared to do any job, partly because having a job strengthened their family man identity and helped them feel as though they were bringing financial resources into their home, and partly because they had a belief that even a rubbish job would eventually lead to a better job. The parole failures, on the other hand, believed that they were too good to do rubbish jobs, and that that was the end of it, really. So they didn't have that kind of future, if I stick with this, life will get better attitude. Interestingly as well, both the successes and the failures talk about similar levels of stress, similar difficult things in their lives to cope with, similar experience of negative emotions. And again, what differentiated them was how they responded to those stresses and negative emotions. So the parole successes talked about consciously employing problem-solving skills, anticipating the consequences of different options, and consciously searching for constructive solutions. So when faced with a difficult problem, their goal was, I need to find a constructive solution to this problem. And by contrast, the parole failures were much more likely to very quickly fall back into, well, committing crime will get me out of this situation. And I highlighted that second one in green because I think that takes us back to cognitive skills programs. Simple, straightforward programs that just teach exactly those skills. How to solve problems, how to anticipate consequences, how to work through different possible solutions and pick the most constructive one. I know I'm probably sounding like I'm here banging the drum for cognitive skills programs, and that wasn't particularly my intention, but when you look at the evidence, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that they are an important part of rehabilitation. Okay, I just wanted to talk a bit more at this point about crime supportive attitudes, which is another of those big 4 risk factors. And if you work with sexual and violent offenders, and I guess most of you do, you're very familiar with this concept because, particularly with sex offenders, which is the literature I know best, there's a massive literature about the nature and the role and the influence of crime supportive attitudes. And in fact, Leslie Helmers has just published a meta-analysis showing establishing the predictive relationship between sex offending supportive attitudes and recidivism. So we know that crime supportive attitudes include rationalizations for crime, identifying with criminal culture, so seeing yourself as a criminal, having that identity and feeling good about that identity. So not something that you're ashamed of, but something that you're proud of. And sometimes that's because the criminal lifestyle is in fact very rewarding, particularly if you're an acquisitive offender. If you're someone who sells drugs or burgles houses, then there's a very quick financial reward to your crimes, which, as we know through principles of reinforcement, probably outweighs any of the negative longer-term consequences, if there are any. So, particularly thinking about acquisitive offenders, actually, these people tend to see crime and a criminal lifestyle as a possibility or a necessity. It's much more a rational choice, perhaps more so than violent or sexual offenders. But I think what's interesting about this is just a graph from a study that our Ministry of Justice commissioned, looking at offenders on probation, and they administered the crime PICS, which you might be familiar with. It's a fairly well-validated self-report measure of attitudes towards crime. It has 3 scales: general your attitudes towards criminal offending, your anticipation that you'll return to crime, and your belief that crime is worthwhile. And what you can see here is a very clear association between how strongly people hold those attitudes and the reoffending rates. Okay. I want to make this point just because I think with some offender subgroups, like sexual offenders, we've really developed and understood this concept of attitudes and its role in criminal behaviour. But with other offender groups, we still are at very early stages of understanding how attitudes that support crime relate to offending. So if we're going to combine the models, because I think I would argue that the RNR model, the Good Lives Model and the Resettlement Model are not competing models, they're actually quite easily combined into complementary models. And actually it would be quite nice if we could come up with a rehabilitation approach that addressed both internal psychological factors and social dynamic factors. If we were going to combine those models, there would probably be 4 things that are still missing from a combination. One would be a failure to look at the environmental or situational factors in which crime is committed. Another would be to identify the rehabilitative climate in which interventions should take place. Another would be the role of biological factors. I'm not going to talk any more about any of those 3 things, but I know from looking through the programme that there are people here who are going to talk about those 3 things. I was very pleased to see how our research is getting clearer, getting more and more focused on these things. What I'm going to talk a bit more about is that none of the models so far that I've discussed so far have really recognised very much in the way of patterns and subgroups within this large heterogeneous offender population. So I just want to talk a bit now about the segmentation approach that we've been taking in our organisation. Segmentation has been our attempt to apply these well-established RNR principles to a whole offender population, in that case we have data now on our entire prison population in England and Wales and our entire probation caseload. So we can use these very large data sets to understand our population in quite a lot of detail, and even when we narrow down to smaller subgroups, our numbers still remain very large. So what we did to start with, we started off sitting in a little room, a few of us, saying, okay, if we were going to apply RNR to our whole population, how would we do it? And our idea was, let's try and divide the population by risk, but also we can't quite divide them by need, but we could divide them definitely by offence types and try and find meaningful subgroups within our population. So our first model, which is the one we published last year as part of our commissioning intentions, and we're now working on refining it, we broke our population down into 35 segments. We had 5 risk categories using the OGRS tool. So by risk, I mean likelihood of reoffending. I'm not talking about harm. Going from low likelihood of reoffending up to that last, remember the graph I showed you earlier, the last group where the OGRS score was between 90 and 99, which we call the prolific group. And we started with 7 categories. So we categorised people by their index offence, not by their criminal history. And there are some reasons for that. So we started with 7 categories. Sex offenders, violent offenders. The violent category is, you can imagine, particularly big and diverse, and we probably need to do some more work on that. Robbery, who we took out from often categorised as violence, but not in our case, because we wanted to think about robbery as a different sort of offending. Acquisitive offending, which goes from burglary of homes or commercial premises is right down to theft and shoplifting. Drugs offending, which included both import, export of drugs down to possession and supply and possession offences. Motoring offences, we don't have very many motoring offenders in prison, but we have a lot on our probation caseload, people who are serving community sentences for particularly drink driving related offences. And then the other category, which has some fantastic individual weird offences in, including my favourite, impersonating a wildlife inspector. A group for whom we don't have a programme at the moment. With our 35 categories, which is quite a lot, we can also then divide. We can look at particular age groups, we can look at men and women separately, we can look at different ethnic groups separately. The more you do that, the more kind of crazy it gets, but it's proven very interesting when we do that. Then our attempt last year, we made a preliminary attempt at mapping the general evidence base onto particular segments, and then we can do that much better for sex offenders and violent offenders, where there is a lot of research about those offender groups in their own right. So here's just to give you an example. This is what our prison population looks like in terms just of risk of reoffending. So you can see here I'm comparing young male adults, 18 to 21, with older adults and with women, and immediately you can see across our prison population very different patterns in terms of risk of reoffending. As you would expect, the younger adults, which are the grey bars, are much higher risk of reoffending. That's clearly because youth is so heavily weighted as a risk factor. The little circle there just is something we added to this slide as a way of showing where we think the evidence base shows us we can most effectively intervene. So when you look at the impact of typical kind of RNR programs, they seem to work best in that middle range group. Okay, this is, now I haven't got all of the offence type segments, but I've got 5 of the offence type segments here. So here we're breaking down a bit further, looking at offence type and likelihood of reoffending at the same time. This is just our prison population, our custodial population. So here you can see, for example, again, perhaps not surprising, that the sexual offenders are very much at the low risk of recidivism side of the graph. I'm sure you're not surprised by this, but I can tell you that prison governors, for example, are very surprised by this. Prison staff are very surprised. And that's because the media in our country continually tells everybody that sex offenders are the highest risk people going, and gives the impression that 98% of sex offenders reoffend within 1 day of release and that kind of thing. So just having a graph like this, which is why the sex offenders are in red, helps to contradict some of those messages. You can also see at the other end, as we get a higher risk of recidivism, the acquisitive offenders start to take over more. And that particular prolific group on the right-hand side are all acquisitive offenders, and in fact, within the acquisitive offender group, their offending preferences are very narrow. They tend to either steal cars or steal from cars. So we've got quite a narrowly defined group at that end. This is just looking at our short sentence prisoners. So these are prisoners sentenced to 12 months or less, who at the moment in England and Wales serve a short prison sentence and then are released without any community supervision, although the government is currently changing that policy. But again, you can see here we've got quite a different population again. We know that the short sentence prisoners in England and Wales have particularly high reconviction rates, and that is often used as evidence of a failure of imprisonment. But actually what's happening is these particular group of offenders are doing what they are predicted to do. They are higher risk and therefore they're reoffending at higher rates. Looking at women is quite interesting because women have very different profiles to men in terms of their risk of reoffending and offence types. Obviously we have hardly any female sexual offenders, and the ones we do have a very low risk. But perhaps the thing that surprises people most about this graph is that most people assume that the majority of women in custody are acquisitive offenders in for theft and shoplifting, which is seen as the kind of female offending. But actually we've got quite a significant number of high-risk violent women in custody, and in fact that's as you get into the higher risk groups, that they become quite a significant group. And lastly, just to show you another piece of interesting information, this is what happens if you look at reconviction rates by offence type. And again, this is quite a nice graph for busting some myths about who reoffends. So you can, and this is any reoffending. So the sexual offenders on the right-hand side of the graph have the lowest reconviction rates of all offence types, and that includes non-sexual offending. So if we looked at their sex offending only, there would be a much smaller number. So most of our knowledge and most of our resources goes into the groups at the lower likelihood of reconviction end of the graph, the sex offenders and the violent offenders. They're the people for whom we have most research and most of our intervention money is spent on those groups. And you can, that makes sense because their offending is more harmful. But if we spend our money on those groups, then it's perhaps unfortunate that any organisation is criticised for not reducing reoffending when you have the high reoffending rates being caused by people at the left-hand side of the graph, the people who commit theft from vehicles. And I often point out with this slide that there are numerous learned societies and journals associated with the right-hand side of the graph, and I belong to quite a lot of them, but we have yet to have a journal about people who thieve from vehicles or a professional society for the study of people who thieve from vehicles. Okay, this is just to give you an example of some of the things we've learned from segmenting the population and then trying to study how they respond differently to treatment. I'm going to skip through this a bit. This is an early Canadian study from 1995. It's published in the Canadian Correctional Service, I think Correctional Service of Canada website. Yeah. I couldn't show you the graphs because there's something wrong with the document on the internet and you can't get all of the figures, so I had to put the text instead. And I'm not going to read it out, but basically what this tells us, this was a study of the reasoning and rehabilitation program in Canada, that they looked at impact by offence type. And sex offenders and violent offenders have responded best to the program, or had the program had the most impact on reconviction. Burglars and robbers didn't show reduced reconviction after doing the program. Now this study, as far as I can tell, wasn't published in a journal. I've only ever found it on the CSC website. And they really downplayed their results as well, I think because they were a bit surprised by them, and they said, well, we need more replication. The sex offender thing doesn't quite make sense because we all expect to do sex offending focus programs for sex offenders. The burglary and robbery thing, might be an anomaly. So we decided we would have a look ourselves at our own population. The first thing we did was we looked at whether acquisitive offenders have the same need for cognitive skills training as violent and sexual offenders. And what we found there was that they do. This is 3 groups of people who did, again, our ETS, Enhanced Thinking Skills Programme. People who had no history of acquisitive offending, people who had some acquisitive offending, and people who were very specialist acquisitive offenders. And in this study, using psychometric measures, we found that acquisitive offenders looked just like everybody else in terms of their impulsivity, their locus of control, and they responded to ETS and showed change just like everybody else. So then we went on to look at reconviction rates. And this is a study we've got submitted for publication at the moment. So This is, we use a predicted versus actual design here, and what you can see here is we found the same pattern as the Canadian study, that despite the fact that acquisitive offenders look like robbers and look like sex offenders and violent offenders, in terms of impulsivity and low self-control, the impact of a programme designed to address those things was significant for sex offenders and for violent offenders, but not for burglars and robbers. And in fact, if you took burglars and robbers or acquisitive offenders out of our cohort, the impact of the programme overall would have been much higher. It would have jumped from, I think it's 8% to, I can't remember. Anyway, maybe it's on the next slide. No, it isn't. Anyway, you can see here that we've got the green bars are what the actual impact of ECS was. This is by different reconviction rates. The blue bars show you how much better the impact would have been if we only had non-acquisitive offenders in the programme. We found similar patterns when we looked at young offenders, actually slightly more marked with the young offenders. And when we looked at women, we found again a similar pattern, but with some differences in that the acquisitive, the robbers and the burglars in the women offender group did show some reduced reconviction after ECS. It just wasn't as marked as it was with the other offender types. Okay. So hopefully that's just given you some idea of the value of more consciously looking at responsiveness, differentiated responsiveness to interventions. I'm just going to finish for the third part of the presentation by looking at how we can do our research better to develop our knowledge faster. I'm going to skip quite fast through some of these slides, but there is a project which some of you might be aware of called the STARR Project, which was a trans-Europe project, and Friedrich Losel at the University of Cambridge was the lead academic for this project. And their idea, or their aim, was to look at programmes aiming to reduce reoffending across Europe and what evidence base we have for them. So they surveyed current practice across all of the European countries. They did a systematic review and a meta-analysis, or intended to, on 3 particular topics: the impact of drug treatment programmes on offending, the impact of interventions with young offenders, and the effectiveness of domestic violence programmes. They couldn't do a meta-analysis on domestic violence programmes because there wasn't enough of them. I'm going to flick quickly through this because you always get a better idea when I go through it at speed about what the pattern was. But you can see here, looking at drug programmes, the survey found a reasonable number of different drug programmes across Europe. Far less of them had ever conducted an evaluation. Even less of those had conducted an evaluation using reconviction data. Even less had a comparison group, and I think there was probably 1 randomised control trial. So the difference between the number of evaluations and the number of programmes was very marked. And the conclusion was, this is a problem. Let's look at young offender programmes in Europe. The picture looks almost exactly the same, and the conclusions are exactly the same. For the large majority of European countries, we couldn't find any evaluation with sufficient methodological quality. DV perpetrators, here we go again. Quite a lot of programmes, about half of them had conducted an evaluation, about half of those had recidivism outcome data, and I think again, I don't know why the graph is, oh, no, sorry, yes, 1 study I think had a comparison group, no randomised control trials. So the overall conclusions of the STARR Project, a multinational academic research project to combine studies across a large number of European countries, was we couldn't do it. There is such a disparity between what's happening and how well it's being evaluated that actually we're unable to draw any conclusions about what works in Europe. So let's just have a quick think in the last 5 minutes about what we could do to improve this situation. And when I started thinking about this, I was thinking about the position that I'm in and the different kinds of research that we have been involved with or that we have reviewed for our organisation. And what we see is that there are different relationships between researchers and practitioners and policymakers. And the nature of those, or the differences between those relationships, tends to affect the kind of study you get. So for example, here's one model of what I've called service-embedded research. So you have a service, maybe an intervention of some sort, and within that service there is an evaluator or a researcher who is trying to evaluate the quality of the service or the outcome of the service. There are some advantages to this model. It can work really well. I've seen 1 or 2 studies of this nature that have been just excellent. One of the reasons why this kind of research works well is that you get a very high service buy-in. So the people delivering the service are very motivated to work well, to work closely with the researcher and to make sure the researcher has all the information that they need. So data collection is easy, and also feedback from the research to the service is very easy because everyone's always literally sometimes in the same office. But on the other hand, what happens is that policymakers, who are often people who fund services, are not involved, and therefore they don't particularly buy into the intervention, and in fact they, or I should say we, can be suspicious of this sort of research because we sometimes worry that it might be biased or a bit self-serving. And particularly so as work with offenders, rather, unfortunately, is becoming more and more commercialised, so that people are now making money out of their interventions and have a commercial reason for demonstrating their interventions work. And that makes us even more or even less comfortable about research findings that come from the service itself, because invariably they demonstrate that the service works, and sometimes we've seen examples of studies like this where the methodology is quite weak and also quite covered up. So here's a different model, and in this model the policymakers who fund the service get together with the researchers and they say, we'd like you to go and evaluate this service. So the policymakers and the researchers hold hands and the service is sitting over there on its own. The advantages of this is that you don't have that bias problem. The researcher is independent of the service, that minimises the bias, and the policymaker has good buy-in to the service, to the research, so they're interested in the results. The disadvantage though, and I've been involved in a number of projects where I've collapsed because of this, is that the service isn't interested or doesn't value the research or feels threatened by it, and they just don't comply. So I took over a few years ago in one of our reshuffles of duties. I had to take over management of a project that was exactly like this, and the researchers were always emailing me saying, we can't get the data we need from the service manager. And I would say, well, have you talked to him? And they'd say no, because he won't answer our calls. And then I would call the service manager and I would get the message that he was out and he wouldn't return my calls either. And basically he just decided that he wasn't interested, he didn't care about this research, he didn't trust it, he had no buy-in to it, and he wasn't going to comply with it. And that was probably a better outcome than deciding that he was going to deliberately sabotage it, which also could have been possible. So data collection can suffer, and if the service manager doesn't value the research, then the research can end up feeling threatening and certainly not being a helpful process. Here's another model. Those of you who work in academic settings and are not linked to practice organisations or services may be more likely to be engaged in this kind of research, where the researchers sit separately to the policy and to the service, and they come in completely independently to do their research. The advantages of this model is the research itself, the quality tends to be the best in my experience. This is where we get the most robustly designed projects because the researchers are more likely to be pure academics and to have high research standards. The downside, though, is that this research often does ask and answer the wrong questions. So it might ask or answer questions of academic interest, but the policymaker or the service provider don't feel that they're the right questions, they're not the questions that they have. And perhaps as a result of that, it doesn't always influence policy as it should. One example that often comes to mind here is a meta-analysis, in fact, looking at the effectiveness of cognitive behavioural interventions, that was a very robustly conducted statistical analysis. And one of its findings was that if you add a victim empathy component to cognitive behavioural interventions, you reduce the impact of the intervention. Now, to me, that's a very important finding. In our organisation, we have a lot of victim empathy programmes running because intuitively service providers feel that's an important thing to do. And because that research was independent of any service or any policymaker, most people don't know about it, and when I tell them about it, they're not very interested because it feels very remote from what they're doing in their everyday life. So these sorts of research can be very good, but unless you have people whose job it is, a bit like mine, to make sure that other people hear the findings, it doesn't always integrate into practice as it should. So here's what should look like the ideal model. This should be the answer to all of these problems when you have everybody holding hands, the policy people, the researchers and the service all go into the relationship together. And And we had a study like this. In fact, I was involved in a study like this last year when I was in the policy circle, which is not my favourite place to be. We had a service, which in this case was a prison that had declared itself to be a rehabilitative prison. And we wanted a researcher to go in and try and identify the features of a rehabilitative culture. And in this case, this model worked well because everyone was bought into it. I was bought into it because I'd asked for it and paid for it. Not personally, obviously, but with my services money. And the prison was also very keen because they were proud of what they were doing and they wanted to have independent scrutiny. The outcome has influenced both the prison in terms of how they're doing, delivering their rehabilitative culture, and also our policies, because we are using the outcomes of that study to inform our commissioning for other prisons. The researcher feels very satisfied because he feels he made a difference, and I know that that's one of the things that most researchers want to do. There's nothing quite as good as doing a research study and then seeing something change for the better as a result of what you've done. And in this situation, that is exactly what he felt. I won't say it wouldn't, in this case, didn't produce definitive findings because it was a preliminary study, but having all of those things working together does make it much more likely that the outcome of a study could be closer to definitive. But the disadvantages are that it's quite hard to manage because it's quite easy for this model to collapse because actually the three people have got different needs. And I do suspect that in the example I've given you, the reason it didn't collapse is because the researcher found lots of positive things about the prison. And I wonder if he'd found less positive things, if I might have had a worse job on my hands trying to keep everybody happy. So when the needs of the three parties start to vary, then it becomes harder to hold this model together. And it's also hard to replicate because you have quite a unique setting and a unique set of relationships, and it's hard to lift that up. And in fact, in this case, we looked at lifting the model and putting the same researcher in a different prison and I go there. And so we haven't yet been able to replicate that study, and I believe that replication is very important. So I've run over very slightly, I do apologise, I just looked at my watch. But just going to go back to the 3 key points. If you dozed off, this is the time to wake up. You'll think that we're still where we were when we started. So the 3 things I've talked about are comparing the models, looking at their differences, looking at their strengths and their limitations. And my conclusion was that these models are not incompatible, but even if we combine them, the state of play at the moment is not enough to capture all of the things we need to do to reduce reoffending. We still have a long way to go. Our segmentation approach, starting to look at distinct risks and needs in smaller subgroups of offenders and look at differential responses to interventions, is exposing a whole new area for research, I think, and a whole new set of research questions that we don't yet know the answers to. And in order to progress with that research, what I'm arguing is that we need to have, or to keep on working towards better collaboration between people with academic skills, people with practice skills, and people with, I can't say policy skills, but people in policy positions. Because the more we can work together, the more likely we are to produce research that everybody feels motivated to respond to and act upon. So there we go. Thank you very much for listening. There's my email address if you want to get the slides, unless they're going to be on the conference website. And as Corinne said, there's the Twitter if you want to start tweeting. I do tweet about football as well as research, so you might find a bit of a strange combination. And thank you very much for listening so early in the morning after a fun run as well. Thank you.